If you've been researching hair loss for any amount of time, you've heard about DHT.
It's presented as the villain, the primary cause of male pattern baldness. And the standard solution is simple. Block DHT with finasteride or dutasteride, maybe add minoxidil for blood flow, and you're done. But here's what almost nobody talks about. Blocking DHT is only addressing part of the problem. And for many men, it's not even addressing the most important part. There's a critical factor that determines whether your hair follicles actually respond to DHT in a destructive way. And that factor is inflammation, specifically chronic low-grade inflammation and microinflammation around the hair follicles. This isn't some fringe theory or alternative medicine idea. This is supported by peer-reviewed research showing that inflammation plays a central role in androgenetic alopecia. And understanding this connection can completely change how you approach treating your hair loss. Today we're going to dive deep into the science of DHT sensitivity, the role of inflammation and microinflammation in hair loss, and most importantly, how you can address both of these factors to get better results than you would from just blocking DHT alone. This is about working smarter, not just throwing medications at the problem and hoping for the best. Let's start with the basics. DHT, or dihydrotestosterone, is an androgen hormone derived from testosterone through the action of an enzyme called 5-alpha reductase. In men with androgenetic alopecia, hair follicles in certain areas of the scalp, typically the hairline and crown, are genetically sensitive to DHT. When DHT binds to androgen receptors in these follicles, it triggers a process called miniaturization. Miniaturization is where the hair follicle progressively shrinks with each growth cycle. The growth phase gets shorter, the hair becomes finer and weaker, and eventually the follicle becomes so small that it can only produce barely visible vellus hairs or stops producing hair altogether. This is the standard explanation for male pattern baldness, and it's fundamentally correct. DHT is involved in the process. The conventional medical approach is to block DHT production using 5-alpha reductase inhibitors like finasteride or dutasteride. Finasteride blocks about 70% of DHT production, while dutasteride blocks around 90%. And for many men, this works. Hair loss slows down or stops, and some men even see regrowth. The evidence is solid. These medications are effective. But here's the problem with only focusing on DHT blocking. First, not all men with high DHT levels lose their hair, and not all men with low DHT levels keep their hair. The amount of DHT in your system isn't the only factor that matters. What really matters is how sensitive your hair follicles are to whatever DHT is present. This is called DHT sensitivity, and it's influenced by multiple factors beyond just DHT levels. Second, many men find that DHT blockers work initially but then become less effective over time. They continue losing hair despite being on finasteride for years, or they get good results for a while then suddenly start shedding again. This suggests that something else is going on beyond just DHT levels. Third, DHT has important functions in the body beyond hair follicles. It's involved in muscle development, bone density, mood regulation, libido, and cognitive function. When you systemically block DHT throughout your entire body just to save the hair on your scalp, you're creating a hormonal imbalance that can have consequences. This is why some men experience side effects from finasteride. So what's the alternative? Instead of just blocking DHT, you can work to reduce DHT sensitivity. This means addressing the factors that make your hair follicles overly reactive to DHT in the first place. If you can lower the sensitivity, then even normal or slightly elevated DHT levels won't cause as much damage to your follicles. Think of it like an allergy. Some people can be around cats with no problem. Others have severe allergic reactions. The cat isn't the problem. The cat is just being a cat. The problem is the person's immune system overreacting to cat proteins. Similarly, DHT isn't inherently bad. It's your follicles overreacting to it. If you can reduce that overreaction, you reduce the hair loss. This is where inflammation comes into the picture. Research has shown that men with androgenetic alopecia have elevated inflammatory markers in their scalp tissue compared to men without hair loss. Inflammatory cells infiltrate the area around miniaturizing follicles. Inflammatory cytokines are upregulated. There's oxidative stress and immune system activation happening in the scalp of men with pattern baldness. And here's the crucial connection. Inflammation amplifies DHT sensitivity. When your follicles are in an inflamed state, they become more reactive to androgens. The inflammatory environment lowers the threshold for DHT to cause damage. So even moderate levels of DHT can trigger miniaturization when inflammation is present. But if you reduce the inflammation, those same DHT levels might not cause problems. Studies have found that inflammatory prostaglandins, particularly prostaglandin D2, are elevated in bald scalp compared to haired scalp. Prostaglandin D2 has been shown to inhibit hair growth. When researchers blocked prostaglandin D2 in animal studies, hair growth improved. This demonstrates that inflammatory signaling molecules directly impact hair follicle function. There's also evidence that oxidative stress, which goes hand in hand with inflammation, damages hair follicles and accelerates aging of the follicular cells. Men with androgenetic alopecia have been shown to have lower antioxidant defenses in their scalp tissue. The accumulation of reactive oxygen species causes cellular damage that makes follicles more vulnerable to DHT-induced miniaturization. Now let's talk about the difference between general scalp inflammation and microinflammation, because these are distinct but related issues. Scalp inflammation refers to more obvious visible inflammation of the scalp tissue. This might present as redness, burning sensation, significant itching, flaking, or discomfort. Conditions like seborrheic dermatitis, psoriasis, folliculitis, and other inflammatory scalp conditions fall into this category. If you have frank scalp inflammation, it's going to be very difficult to make progress with hair regrowth no matter what treatments you're using. The inflammatory environment is so hostile to hair follicles that even if you're blocking DHT with finasteride and using minoxidil, the follicles are still under constant assault from inflammatory mediators. Many men find that their hair loss treatments stop working or work poorly when they have active scalp inflammation. Addressing visible scalp inflammation requires a combination of topical and internal approaches. Topically, you need ingredients that calm inflammation, support the skin barrier, and create a healthier scalp environment. This might include things like aloe vera, chamomile, green tea extract, or low-strength corticosteroids in severe cases. Some men find that honey applications or sea salt treatments help with inflammatory scalp conditions. Internally, you need to address the root causes of the inflammation. This often ties back to diet, gut health, immune system dysregulation, stress, and metabolic factors. Food sensitivities and inflammatory diets can absolutely manifest as scalp inflammation. Poor gut health and intestinal permeability can lead to systemic inflammation that affects the scalp. Chronic stress elevates cortisol and inflammatory cytokines. Microinflammation is more subtle, but potentially just as important. This refers to low-grade inflammation specifically around individual hair follicles that may not be visible to the naked eye, but can be detected under magnification or through biopsy. You might not have obvious redness or irritation, but there's still an inflammatory process happening at the follicular level. Men with microinflammation might notice occasional itching in random spots on their scalp, particularly in areas where they're thinning. It might come and go, often getting worse with stress or after eating certain foods. Under a microscope, you'd see redness or inflammation around each individual follicle in the affected areas, particularly in the temples, hairline, and crown, where androgenetic alopecia typically occurs. Microinflammation is insidious because you might not realize it's there. You're focused on blocking DHT and using growth stimulants, but meanwhile there's this underlying inflammatory process quietly amplifying your DHT sensitivity and accelerating follicle miniaturization. This is why some men get disappointing results from hair loss medications. They're not addressing the inflammation that's making their follicles hypersensitive. So what causes this chronic inflammation and microinflammation in the scalp? There are multiple contributing factors and they often work together synergistically. Diet is huge. Inflammatory foods, particularly refined sugars, processed seed oils, and foods you're personally sensitive to can drive systemic inflammation that manifests in your scalp. Some men find that gluten, dairy, or high glycemic foods trigger scalp inflammation and itching. Gut health plays a critical role. Your gut microbiome influences systemic inflammation levels. If you have dysbiosis, overgrowth of pathogenic bacteria, yeast overgrowth, or intestinal permeability, you're going to have elevated inflammatory markers throughout your body, including your scalp. The gut-skin axis is well established in dermatology, and it absolutely applies to the scalp. Liver function is often overlooked. Your liver is responsible for metabolizing hormones, including androgens, and for detoxification. If your liver is overburdened or not functioning optimally, you'll have higher levels of inflammatory metabolites circulating in your system. This can increase both systemic inflammation and alter hormone metabolism in ways that exacerbate hair loss. Oxidative stress from poor mitochondrial function, environmental toxins, lack of antioxidants in the diet, or chronic stress all contribute to inflammation. Your cells produce energy in the mitochondria, and this process generates reactive oxygen species as a byproduct. If you don't have adequate antioxidant defenses, these free radicals cause cellular damage and inflammation. Chronic psychological stress is a massive driver of inflammation. Cortisol and other stress hormones have complex effects on immune function and inflammatory pathways. Many men notice their hair loss accelerates during periods of high stress. Part of this is the direct effect of stress hormones on hair follicles, but part of it is stress-induced inflammation amplifying DHT sensitivity. Scalp environment issues like excessive sebum production, imbalanced scalp microbiome, buildup of dead skin cells, or poor circulation all contribute to local inflammation. If your scalp is constantly producing excess oil, if you have overgrowth of bacteria or yeast, or if there's poor lymphatic drainage, you're creating conditions for chronic low-grade inflammation. Now here's where this gets really practical. If you address these inflammatory factors while also managing DHT, you get synergistic effects. You're not just blocking one pathway, you're improving the overall health of the follicular environment while simultaneously reducing the trigger. This multi-pronged approach is more effective than either strategy alone. Now let's talk about how to actually implement this. On the DHT side, you have options. You can use pharmaceutical DHT blockers like finasteride or dutasteride if you're comfortable with that approach. You can use topical anti-androgens like topical finasteride or RU58841 to reduce DHT in the scalp while minimizing systemic effects. Or you can use natural DHT inhibitors like saw palmetto, pumpkin seed oil, nettle root extract, or pygeum, which have more modest effects but also minimal side effects. The key insight is that if you reduce inflammation and DHT sensitivity, you need less aggressive DHT blocking to achieve the same results. Some men find that by addressing inflammation, they can maintain their hair on lower doses of finasteride or with natural DHT blockers alone, whereas before they were losing ground even on higher doses. On the inflammation side, you need to work both topically and internally. Topically, you want to use ingredients that have anti-inflammatory properties and support scalp health. Ketoconazole shampoo has anti-inflammatory effects beyond just its antifungal properties. Essential oils like rosemary, peppermint, and tea tree have anti-inflammatory and circulation boosting effects. Caffeine applied topically has been shown to have anti-inflammatory properties, but be careful with medicated shampoos. While they can be useful short-term for addressing specific problems like fungal overgrowth or bacterial issues, long-term reliance on strong medicated shampoos can actually disrupt your scalp microbiome and potentially weaken follicles. The goal should be to address the root cause of the inflammation, not to perpetually suppress symptoms with harsh topicals. Internally, diet is your foundation. An anti-inflammatory diet emphasizing whole foods, plenty of vegetables, quality proteins, healthy fats from fish and nuts, and minimal processed foods can significantly reduce systemic inflammation. Identifying and eliminating personal trigger foods is crucial. Some men need to experiment with eliminating gluten, dairy, or high glycemic foods to see if their scalp inflammation improves. Supporting gut health through probiotics, prebiotics, and healing protocols for intestinal permeability can reduce the inflammatory load. Many men find that addressing gut issues leads to improvements in their scalp condition and better responses to hair loss treatments. Liver support through adequate hydration, limiting alcohol and processed foods, and potentially using milk thistle or other hepatoprotective supplements can improve detoxification and hormone metabolism. When your liver is functioning well, you handle inflammatory compounds and hormones more efficiently. Increasing antioxidant intake through diet and potentially supplementation helps counter oxidative stress. Vitamin C and E, selenium, N-acetylcysteine, and various polyphenols from colorful fruits and vegetables all support your antioxidant defense systems. This protects follicles from oxidative damage that amplifies DHT sensitivity. Stress management can't be emphasized enough. Meditation, adequate sleep, regular exercise, time in nature, whatever works for you to keep cortisol levels in check and reduce the inflammatory impact of chronic stress. This isn't just good for your general health, it directly impacts your scalp inflammation and DHT sensitivity. Scalp care practices matter too. Regular gentle scalp massage improves circulation and may help with lymphatic drainage, reducing congestion and inflammation. Keeping your scalp clean but not overwashing, using appropriate water temperature, and avoiding harsh chemicals all contribute to a balanced scalp environment. Now let's talk about tracking, because this is critical. When you're taking a multifactorial approach to hair loss, you need objective data to know what's working. Your perception can be unreliable. Some days your hair looks great, other days it looks terrible, often based on lighting, styling, or your mood rather than actual changes. This is where systematic tracking becomes invaluable. Taking consistent photos in the same lighting and angles every month gives you visual documentation. But even better is using tools that can quantify hair density and coverage over time. When you have objective measurements, you can see whether your comprehensive approach is working or if you need to adjust something. The advantage of addressing both DHT and inflammation is that you often see improvements beyond just hair. Men report better skin, better energy, better mood, better gut function. You're not just treating a symptom, you're improving your overall health in ways that happen to be very good for your hair. And here's something interesting that we've observed from users who track their hair systematically while implementing anti-inflammatory protocols. Many of them see improvements in hair quality and density that correlate with reductions in scalp inflammation. When they address gut health, clean up their diet, manage stress, and use appropriate topical treatments, their tracking data shows measurable progress. Users who combine inflammation management with DHT management, whether pharmaceutical or natural, tend to show better results than those who only focus on blocking DHT. The combination approach attacks the problem from multiple angles, creating an environment where follicles can actually recover rather than just slowing down their decline. One pattern that emerges consistently is that men who reduce microinflammation while using hair loss treatments experience less shedding overall. Their baseline daily hair loss decreases. This makes sense because you're removing the inflammatory stress that was causing excessive shedding, and you're making the follicles less sensitive to DHT at the same time. It's worth noting that this approach requires more effort than just taking a pill. You have to pay attention to your diet, manage stress, possibly take multiple supplements, use topical treatments consistently, and track your progress. But the payoff is that you're building a foundation of health that supports not just hair retention but long-term results. Here's the problem with relying solely on DHT blockers without addressing inflammation. Over time, those medications can become less effective. Your follicles are still under inflammatory stress, still experiencing oxidative damage, still being affected by poor scalp health. The DHT blocker is doing its job, but the underlying sensitivity keeps increasing. Eventually, you need stronger medications, higher doses, or additional interventions. But if you address the factors driving DHT sensitivity, you can potentially get stable long-term results with less aggressive pharmaceutical intervention. Some men find they can maintain their hair with just natural approaches once they've resolved the inflammatory component. Others find they need less finasteride or can switch to topical finasteride with good results once they've addressed inflammation. The goal is to create a resilient, healthy follicular environment where your hair can thrive. DHT management is part of that, but it's not the whole picture. Inflammation management is the other critical piece that makes everything else work better. Let me give you a practical framework for implementing this. First, assess where you are. Do you have visible scalp inflammation with redness, burning, or severe itching? Or do you have more subtle signs like occasional itching in thinning areas? Understanding your baseline helps you prioritize interventions. Second, address any frank scalp inflammation first. If you have seborrheic dermatitis, psoriasis, or other obvious inflammatory conditions, you need to get those under control before you can expect good results from hair loss treatments. Use appropriate topical treatments short term, but focus on identifying and addressing root causes. Third, implement an anti-inflammatory lifestyle foundation. Clean up your diet, identify trigger foods, support gut health, reduce stress, ensure adequate sleep, and increase antioxidant intake. This creates the internal environment for reduced inflammation. Fourth, optimize your scalp care routine. Use gentle cleansing, appropriate products that don't irritate, consider topical anti-inflammatory ingredients, and practice regular scalp massage. Create a healthy external environment for your follicles. Fifth, implement appropriate DHT management based on your situation and preferences. This might be pharmaceutical, natural, topical, or a combination. The key is that with reduced inflammation, you'll likely get better results from whatever DHT approach you choose. Sixth, track your progress objectively over time. Monthly documentation allows you to see whether your approach is working and make adjustments as needed. Don't rely on subjective impressions, use data. The timeline for seeing results from this comprehensive approach is typically 3 to 6 months for noticeable changes, with optimal results at 12 months or beyond. This is slower than we'd like, but hair growth is inherently slow. The advantage is that you're building sustainable, long-term improvements rather than just suppressing symptoms. Some men see rapid improvements in scalp comfort and reduction in shedding within weeks of addressing inflammation. This is encouraging and suggests you're on the right track. The actual regrowth and thickening takes longer, but reducing shedding is often the first sign of success. One thing to understand is that this approach requires troubleshooting and personalization. Not everyone has the same inflammatory triggers. For some men, it's primarily diet related. For others, it's stress or gut health. Some men have significant scalp microbiome issues. You need to experiment, track results, and adjust based on what you observe. This is fundamentally different from the conventional approach of just taking finasteride and hoping for the best. It requires engagement and experimentation, but the payoff is that you develop a deep understanding of your body and what affects your hair. You're not dependent on a single medication, you're building resilience. And importantly, this approach has minimal downside risk. Eating an anti-inflammatory diet, managing stress, supporting gut health, and using gentle scalp care aren't going to hurt you. The worst case is you improve your overall health but don't see dramatic hair improvements. The best case is you save your hair while feeling better overall. Compare that to the risk profile of just taking increasingly aggressive medications without addressing underlying factors. You might get stuck on a treadmill of escalating interventions with diminishing returns and increasing side effect risks. Let me be clear though, I'm not saying you shouldn't use finasteride or that DHT blocking is bad. For many men, pharmaceutical DHT blockers are an important part of their strategy. What I am saying is that DHT blocking alone is incomplete. The inflammation piece is crucial and often neglected. The most powerful approach combines both. Use appropriate DHT management for your situation, whether that's pharmaceutical or natural, topical or oral, and simultaneously address the inflammatory factors that amplify DHT sensitivity. This comprehensive strategy gives you the best chance of success with the lowest risk profile. Think of it like building a house. DHT blockers are like putting up walls to keep out rain. That's important and necessary, but if your foundation is cracked and eroding, those walls won't save you long term. Addressing inflammation is like fixing the foundation. Once the foundation is solid, the walls do their job much more effectively. The research supporting the inflammation connection in androgenetic alopecia continues to grow. We're learning more about specific inflammatory pathways, immune system involvement, and the interplay between inflammation and androgen signaling. This isn't fringe science, it's the frontier of hair loss research. As this research advances, we'll likely see new treatments specifically targeting inflammation and hair loss. There are already some in development, but you don't need to wait for future medications. You can address inflammation right now through lifestyle, diet, and appropriate interventions. The DHT-inflammation connection explains a lot of patterns we see in hair loss. It explains why some men respond well to treatments while others don't. It explains why stress causes hair shedding. It explains why hair loss often correlates with other inflammatory conditions. It explains why some men's hair loss accelerates despite being on finasteride. Understanding this connection empowers you to take a more sophisticated approach to preserving your hair. You're not just a passive recipient of medications, you're actively creating conditions for hair health. You're addressing root causes, not just suppressing symptoms. So here's my recommendation. If you're currently only blocking DHT and not seeing the results you want, start investigating the inflammation angle. Look at your diet, your gut health, your stress levels, your scalp condition. Implement anti-inflammatory strategies and track what happens. If you're just starting your hair loss journey, build your approach on both pillars from the beginning. Manage DHT appropriately for your situation and simultaneously address inflammation. This gives you the best foundation for long-term success. And remember, this is a marathon, not a sprint. Sustainable hair preservation requires building health, not just fighting decline. The inflammation-focused approach is about building health at the follicular and systemic level. Combined with intelligent DHT management, it's the most comprehensive strategy available. Your hair is worth the effort, but more importantly, your overall health is worth the effort. The beauty of this approach is that they're the same thing. What's good for reducing inflammation and supporting your hair is also good for your energy, your gut, your skin, your mood, and your long-term health. You're not sacrificing anything, you're gaining everything. Take this seriously. Address both DHT and inflammation. Track your progress objectively. Give it time and see what your hair can do when you create the conditions for it to thrive. The DHT inflammation connection is the key that unlocks better results. Use it wisely.